this article doesn't scare the shit out of you, we're in real trouble. If this article doesn't rouse you to anger, fury, rage, and action, gay men may have no future on this earth. Our continued existence depends on just how angry you can get. There are now 1,112 cases of serious acquired immune deficiency syndrome. When we first became worried, there were only 41. In a 28-day period of March 1983, 73 people died from AIDS, and there were 164 new cases. This is an excerpt from Larry Kramer's 1,112 and Counting article. The AIDS epidemic was beginning to ignite, and the response by society was dreadfully silent. Larry Kramer was known as a playwright, which soon translated in the early 1980s to writing for publications to draw attention to the eluding AIDS crisis. Larry Kramer is a well-known AIDS activist who founded Gay Men's Health Crisis Center in New York City in 1982. Kramer went on to be a founding member of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, commonly known as ACT UP, in 1987. Kramer's activist career began in the early 1980s as the AIDS crisis was just beginning to flare up. In March of 1983, the New York Native published an article written by Larry Kramer titled 1,112 and Counting. This article helped begin the movement of fighting the AIDS epidemic. During this time, doctors began openly stating that they do not know what is going on. Over the past few years, doctors had continued to develop new theories and constantly try to come up with a cause. Most of these causes were linked to uncertainties surrounding this syndrome caused patients to be treated insufficiently. Patients are now more treated like lepers as hospital staffs become increasingly worried that AIDS is infectious. 86% of people infected with AIDS pass away within 3 years. This statement from Larry Kramer is passionate and provoking. It is a rally cry to unite for change. It is a call to reject complacency and step out into the front lines. On March 10, 1987, the national fight against AIDS was forever changed with the formation of ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. ACT UP was formed in reaction to government complacency. On this day in 1987, Larry Kramer gave a speech at the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community Center in New York City. He provoked the audience by saying, "At the rate we are going, you could be dead in less than 5 years." This event marked the formation of ACT UP in a new era in the fight against AIDS. The organization motto states, "United in anger and committed to direct action to end the AIDS crisis." As one of the founding members of ACT UP, Larry Kramer is respected greatly. In 1991, Kramer gave the keynote speech at a gay pride rally in Union Square, New York City. At this time, the AIDS crisis had been occurring for more than a decade. People were heartbroken and tired. People who were previously involved in activism began to participate less. Larry Kramer's speech served as a rallying cry to reignite the fire in the movement to fight AIDS. Throughout the AIDS crisis, people were feeling very emotionally raw. They had watched their friends and lovers die while the government did nothing. Kramer drew upon this pain in an oration to ignite the fire within everyone to rise up and fight back. The AIDS epidemic was quickly taking the lives of gay men while the government remained silent on the matter. Kramer attributes the lack of government action to the community being impacted, gay men. Kramer states, "We have been hearing from the beginning of this epidemic that it was only a question of time before the straight community came down with AIDS, and that when that happened, AIDS would suddenly be high on all agendas for funding and research, and then we would finally be looked after and all would be well." The Center for Disease Control was neglecting its role in AIDS research. They weren't interviewing the infected or gathering appropriate information they needed. There have been so many AIDS victims that the CDC is no longer able to get them fast enough. It has given up. The National Institute of Health is not allocating its $8 million in funding to fight AIDS. The ACT UP organization went on to organize protests, such as the historical March on Wall Street to fight the $10,000 annual cost of the only federal Drug Administration approved drug to treat AIDS. In 1988, ACT UP staged a die-in at the FDA to protest their slow drug testing process. This resulted in 176 arrests. ACT UP was provocative in their organizing and came to bring great change to society. Kramer has a strong rebuke and critique for the mayor of New York, Ed Koch. The mayor will not engage in conversation with any gay organization in the city. He refuses to publicly acknowledge the AIDS epidemic and who it is impacting. The mayor of New York has an enormous amount of power when he wants to use it, and when he wants to help his people. With the failure yet again of our civil rights bill, I guess our mayor doesn't want to use his power to help us. With his silence on AIDS, the mayor of New York is helping to kill us. Kramer criticizes the horrible elected leaders of the current Bush, Cuomo, and Dickens administrations. They say the right things but do absolutely nothing. These horrible men are the current president of the United States, the governor of New York State, and the mayor of New York City. He states how he is as tired as everyone else of battling hate. George Bush is hate. The Supreme Court is hate. This is a quote from him at the rally. They must all carry on and somehow summon up some kind of strength and hope to fight the seemingly never-ending battle of hate. We shall live to see our futures. He says the money or funding can only be gathered from George Bush and his idiots in the White House. And he calls for activists to unite their energy to fight against George Bush. On September 1st, there will be a united front of nationwide actions directed against George Bush and his do-nothing administration. Kramer is expressing his frustrations are with the government and their apathy. His frustrations are with medical professionals and their fear. His frustrations are with the bigotry projected onto the gay community. And lastly, his frustrations are with gay men themselves and their lack of outrage and action from many. At a time when spirits were low and his community was overcome by mourning, Kramer reignited a fire and motivation to fight and reach higher through his public speaking. In his 1991 speech at a Pride rally in Union Square, New York City, Kramer drew upon his rhetorical devices and in return gathered a lot of attention from his audience. Kramer was seen as a hero to many members of the LGBT community he was speaking to in New York City. He had acquired a great sense of ethos over the years. Ethos is one's credibility and ethical draw, and their use of persuasion. Credibility is given to those people whom are admired and hold high respect. This credibility can be demonstrated through the speakers presenting their authority on the subject matter. When Kramer was announced at Union Square Park as the keynote speaker, he was introduced as one of the founding members of the Gay Men's Health Crisis Center and ACT UP. The positive impacts these organizations had on society shows the significance of Kramer being there to speak and how important his words would be. Kramer created great emotional response from his audience. His pathos, or use of specific examples, language, and creation of images, elicited emotional reaction. Anger at social injustice is one of the most common types of pathos. Kramer opened his speech with a dedication to the AIDS activists Phil Zwinkler and Vito Russo, who had recently passed away. These men were also Kramer's dear friends. The audience related to this emotionally because they knew of the great work of Zwinkler and Russo had accomplished. They also were all mourning the loss of some of their own loved ones to this epidemic. Kramer states he wants to give a hopeful speech, but that he cannot do that today. This invoked a common feeling amongst the audience. They are burned out due to the continued persistence of this virus and society's response to it. Kramer goes on to say, it is a responsibility, an obligation, that we must repay fate or God or our souls or whatever you believe in for this privilege of still being here, of being alive, of not being tortured alive by one of the many plagues that have sought us daily, be it AIDS or homophobia or racism. This statement is noteworthy. It creates a moment for people to evaluate what has happened around them and how lucky they are to still be standing today. It gives the audience a sense of obligation to do more, to engage in action. He calls on them to summon up energy in the loved ones they have lost, because they must honor them, and how they must embrace and not be afraid to love each other. They must honor themselves. Pathos is used throughout the course of Kramer's speech to engage the audience's emotions, in hopes then to also engage their spirit to the cause to become active and organize and fight against AIDS. Logic and reasoning are used throughout Kramer's speech to provide the audience with tangible examples of AIDS activism and government complacency. Logos is the Aristotelian appeal to logic and reasoning. It has influence over an audience in showing them why they should believe an argument a speaker is creating. The two most significant strategies of logos throughout Kramer's speech are calling on government in action and celebrating the success of activist groups. He begged the crowd to become involved. Kramer provides examples of this hate in terms of refusing to acknowledge the AIDS epidemic, not providing research funding for treatment, and saying blatantly homophobic remarks. He then read a letter from Vito Russo's mother. She critiqued the government powers, stating, "Surely they would have pulled a trigger or given him a poison, which they did with all their homophobic words and hatred. They killed my son, not the AIDS virus." This statement by Russo's mother uses both ethos and pathos. She gives reasoning in terms of government complacency, but also invokes high emotion in her imagery of death. The critique of the government administration is fueled by both pathos and ethos. Kramer states statistical facts of the success of ACT UP to provide logic and reasoning to the audience. He speaks of how they have endured, how their activism has sent waves through industries. They boycotted Philip Morris and won a settlement. He says this was historic because no industry has ever been forced to self-capitulate to gay and lesbian demands. On the date of this speech, there were now 15 drugs being used to treat AIDS, all because of the pressure ACT UP placed on the organizations such as the FDA. These great achievements were accomplished through years of protest and organizing. Kramer is using this speech to persuade the audience to engage in activism again. Showing the past success acts as a source of inspiration for the crowd. He says they all must make organizations such as ACT UP, Queer Nation, and Gay Men's Health Crisis Center more structured to continue their effectiveness. They should model them after armies with cadres and battalions and the lieutenants and generals, because we are in a war. He encourages the crowd to draft themselves into an organization. He says, I beg of you, if you find flaws and faults in these organizations, instead of just bitching, do something to help them. Kramer's use of logic is used to give the crowd substance as to why to continue this hard fight against AIDS. Throughout the course of this speech at Union Square Park, Kramer uses rhetorical devices, intentional language that has an impact on the audience. He uses a love story of two close friends as an anecdote, which serves the purpose of creating an interesting story regarding a real person or event that will engage the listener. He goes on to state that these two men met while both visiting for the weekend and were wildly attracted to each other, but fought their desire and kept their distance from each other because they were afraid to love. They had been through so much heartbreak already. This anecdote drew the attention of the audience and persuaded them to listen to what Kramer was going to say next. He continually uses antithesis to draw in opposing ideas. He shows the differentiation in government inaction and grassroots organization. He draws on the comparison of friends and lovers who have died and those who are still living today. He uses the concept of repetition, which is repeating words or phrases, to reiterate and draw attention to his point when he states, some of us have endured, and thank God some of us are still here. And when he repeated the phrase, we must all hold hands together, at the beginning of multiple sentences. Kramer concludes his speech by shouting, ACT UP, and the crowd begins to chant, ACT UP, fight back, fight AIDS, and they all rise to their feet in applause. The audience was clearly greatly impacted by Kramer's words. Kramer himself has a great amount of ethos associated with him due to his continued and persistent dedication to AIDS activism. Kramer struck a deep emotion within the human soul with his use of pathos. He created images and shared stories of lives of beautiful people. Logos gave the audience a tangible sense of what was happening in society and how they needed to react to it. Kramer's speech was noteworthy and influential. At a time where spirits were low in his community, and his community was overcome by mourning, he reignited a fire and motivation to fight and reach higher. Larry Kramer is an activist, a writer, and a soul shaker. He has dedicated his whole self to fight for his community's survival. His words encourage others to look into themselves and their pain and to find a reason to persist in the pursuit of justice. As he wrote in his play, The Normal Heart and the Destiny of Me, and I always thought the very simplest words must be enough. When I say what things are like, everyone's heart must be torn to shreds. That you'll go down if you don't stand up for yourself. Surely you'll see that.